Good evening, everyone. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sandy Woodley, and it's my privilege to welcome you here to the Wagner Noel Performing Arts Center, one of the biggest assets, I think, in the Permian Basin. I'm the new Texas, yes, round of applause for this place. 4 months in, I've had the pleasure to serve as the president of the University of Texas Permian Basin, and I'm happy to be a part of this community. It's so nice to see all the Midlanders and the Odessians here together tonight for this very important conversation of cooperation, mutual progress for now and in the future. This event was conceived through the leadership of Stonegate Church pastor Patrick Payton. He is well known. A round of applause for Patrick. He is well known for many years of experience with a thoughtful and a practical, applicable theology that is effective in transferring into daily life. During the administration of President George W. Bush, Patrick served as an advisor to the churches that comprised Midland Ministries Alliance. Recently, Patrick was selected to the inaugural class of the Presidential Leadership Scholar Initiative, a very prestigious program that operates in the cooperation with the presidential centers of former presidents Lyndon Johnson, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush. Patrick has been married to Cindy, his high school sweetheart of over 28 years. They have 3 grown children and 2 grandchildren. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Payton.
It's an honor to be here tonight with you, and I didn't know she was going to say all that stuff. So, and I am most proud of the fact that I now get to call myself granddad, and my granddad name is Boomer, and that is. Before I go any further, we have a special guest here this evening that is, in addition to Mr. Metaxas. I was informed, the story is about 3 months ago, I was over at a friend of mine's house, and the mother-in-law who lives in a house attached to theirs, who I've known for a while, her name is Pauline Stork. She's 99 years old as of a couple of days ago, and she walked out to me and she was going to hand me a book by this guy named Eric Metaxas, and she said, "Have you read this book?" And I said, "Yes, I have." And so I asked her to keep her copy, but when we found out Eric was going to be here, she was excited about one of her favorite authors being here. So she came to an event we had last night, got to meet Eric, and Pauline is here with us this evening. I don't know where she is. She's right down here on the second row, and so would you give a round of applause to Pauline? Thank you, Pauline. That's awesome. I hope I can come to an event and stand up when I'm 99 years old. Wow. Well, this evening started because of this book right here. It's called If You Can Keep It, and it is by our guest. I wrote an email back in October of 25th. I'm just going to read it to you. October 25th, 2016. I won't read the whole email, but it was sent to a few friends of mine that are on the front rows here. And this is what I said. I said, in the past few weeks, I've been reading and meditating through a book by a guy named Eric Metaxas. The title of the book is If You Can Keep It. I'd encourage you to read it. I was reminded of the necessity and the calling of American leadership and excellence maintained by we the people. While the elected political representatives of our country largely remain ineffective and sometimes dangerous, it is we the people who must cherish and guard and demand our sacred heritage of freedom and liberty and justice for all. And then we have to pass it on through our lives, our families, and even our practices of business. And so I told him, so why am I sending you this email? Well, I want to encourage you to read the book and then consider something with me. What might it look like for us to work together to bring Eric Metaxas to our region for a day or maybe an evening of speaking to the leaders of our great cities? And by the way, because you're here, you're a leader of our great cities and our great region. Because leadership is influence, nothing more and nothing less, and every one of you influence people. I said it might be a shared step we can take to call out leaders in our region into the tradition of our founding fathers and our nation's establishment, rooted in the trust of divine provision and providence, and cherished and maintained as we, the people, in our daily diligence of our dutiful endeavors, commence our commerce. There is much we could do together in our little neck of the woods. After all, we're world famous for what we do above the ground. Let's start being world famous for who we are and what we do above the ground. And so the discussion started. I'm fully aware that we're not the first group of people to have this conversation. There have been many before us, but the world has changed, and we have been a part of that geopolitical change. People keep asking me, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Are we just going to talk? Well, we're going to talk until we trust each other. And then we're going to talk until we can move to effective action. And tonight we start that conversation, and I thank you for being here. It's my honor to introduce to you the speakers this evening. I say the speakers because as soon as Eric finishes speaking, I'm sorry, Mr. Metaxas, I called you by your first name. I'm really sorry. As soon as Mr. Metaxas finishes speaking, we'll have a Q&A portion to the program, and that will be moderated by my friend Bob Brescia. Let me express, first of all, my appreciation to Dr. Robert Brescia because at the beginning of this conversation, there were many people who told me, and many of you may think this was overblown or not true or whatever, they said, you know what would be historical is if we could get Midland College and UTPB to partner on this thing as well. So we sat down with the John Ben Shepherd Institute in Leadership and Bob Brescia and UTPB. And we sat down with Stephen Thomas at Midland College in the Davidson Lecture Series. And we said, would you get in on this? And they said, absolutely, without a question. And that's why hopefully in the future we'll even sponsor more conversations together as we move towards action. Let me tell you about my friend Bob Brescia, who will be moderating this discussion. Bob Brescia has experience that includes top leadership roles in education, in business, in government, and defense sectors. This part will be particularly interesting to our very, very patriotic region. 27 years of peacetime and wartime service as a soldier, an NCO, and a commissioned officer in the United States Army, serving as an airborne ranger cavalryman. Dr. Brescia has served worldwide and world-class Fortune 500 organizations, specializing in the automotive sector. He's a public and private university faculty teacher, as well as teaching at every level of higher education. He graduated with distinction from the Executive Leadership Doctoral Program at the George Washington University. He's a 2015 recipient of the Texas Civil Rights Project Heroes and Leaders Award, and he serves as the president and the board of directors at Basin PBS. And in addition to that military service, he met his wife, Mary Ann, while serving at the Pentagon together. So now let me introduce Eric Metaxas to you, and when I walk off the stage, will you welcome them both, and we'll welcome Eric to the podium. Some of you already know Eric Metaxas is a prolific writer, a litany of materials and accolades to his name. His books are for sale out there in the lobby afterwards, and Eric will be there. He told me till his arm falls off or you leave to sign those books. He is perhaps best known for his books, Amazing Grace. It's the biography and history of William Wilberforce and the heroic campaign to end slavery. He is also the author of Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, and Spy, the biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Also the book I mentioned and many others. His newly released project, Martin Luther, the Man Who Rediscovered God and Changed the World, is available for you in the lobby as well. But of interest to me is it has been well said that if you can communicate with toddlers your message and they understand it, then you can communicate with adults. I now know why Eric Metaxas can communicate with adults, because not only is he a New York Times bestseller and does he hold that status, but he has authored children's books. It's Time to Sleep, My Love, Squanto and the Miracle of Thanksgiving, and perhaps his most famous work, writing scripts for Veggie Tales. Any man who can communicate through a tomato and a cucumber can communicate to adults. He is the founder and host of the New York City-based event series Socrates in the City, Conversations on the Examined Life, and he is also the host of the nationally syndicated radio program, The Eric Metaxas Show, which I think we found out today will start playing in the Midland market very soon. So would you please join me in thanking Bob Brescia and in welcoming Eric Metaxas to the podium.
Thank you, Patrick. Don't ever call me Eric again. Mr. Metaxas. I can't believe that. All the work that I put into this career to be called Eric publicly. It's very embarrassing. It is such a joy to be invited to be here and to be here. I have been to Midland before. I noticed it's still very flat. I don't know if, is that just my observation? But it is a joy to be here, and it's particularly a joy to be here for an event like this. When a community says we want to unite to do something, do you understand how rare that is, how extraordinary that is? I know from talking to Patrick that there's not any agenda. It's just a sense that we should do something. And for me to be invited into the midst of that right now, it is just an honor for me. I want to tell you a little bit about myself before I launch into telling you about Martin Luther. Some of you don't know me. I live in New York City with my wife and daughter. Actually, our daughter just went off to college. And my wife and I are really from that region. I grew up in New York City and Connecticut. She grew up in New Jersey. But it's really, it's that neck of the woods, which is very different from this part of the world. My parents met in an English class in 1956. My dad came to the United States from Greece. My mom came from Germany, and they met in an English class. And of course, if you marry and you're a Greek and a German, you will raise your children Greek. I don't know if you understand how that works, just the way it works. So I grew up in the Greek Orthodox Church, a really warm community. I know that you don't have many Greeks in Texas. I know that because the other day in Dallas, I was introduced at a Barnes & Noble as Eric Metaxas. And I said, no es verdad, yo soy Enrique Metaxas. But I was very, hola. I was very, very amazed by that and entertained by that. But the point is, I grew up in an ethnic community. Some of you have grown up in ethnic communities. Some of you have just grown up in tight cultural communities. The Greek Orthodox community, when you come from another place to America or wherever it is, you stick together. And so the Greeks kind of hang out in the church when they're not working in the diners, because that's where we work. You don't have a lot of Greek diners here, obviously, by the low amount of laughter that I got on that surefire joke in every other part of the country. But the fact of the matter is that even though I was in the church every Sunday as an altar boy, I never got the guts of what it was. It was just a nice cultural thing. And some of you have that, right? You've got a cultural thing. Maybe you go to synagogue or you go to church, whatever's a cultural thing. But for me, when I went to college, I had the fortune and misfortune of going to Yale University, which is ever so slightly secular, in case you're wondering. But to be fair, I'm always kicking Yale. They've only been that way for 210 years. So to be perfectly fair, it's a recent thing. But when you go into an environment like that, which then in the 80s was intensely politically correct, you're kind of told that faith stuff, we don't take that very seriously, and that patriotism stuff, we really don't take seriously. It was kind of like you drink that Kool-Aid, you know? And coming from a working class background, I kind of thought, oh, this is how the elites think. And you take it in, and I realized that I had no idea what I really believed. I really didn't know what I believed. What were my deep values? Did I believe in the Bible? And I had no idea. It was just a cultural thing. So I graduated. I was quite confused. Usually at places that are intensely secular, they don't want to ask the big questions. Because what's an education about? Ultimately, it should be about, who are you? Where do you come from? Where are you going? What does it mean to be a human being? Does life have meaning? If you don't know the answers to those questions, those are very scary questions. And so at a place like Yale and a lot of academia across the United States, they encourage you not to think about those questions. Here's what you do. Just study really hard, get a great job, and work really hard, and it'll all be over in a few decades. Just don't think about those questions. Because if you think about the idea that life literally has no meaning, we evolved out of the muck through random mutations, then it follows logically that life literally has no meaning. Now, the reason you can't comprehend that is because it's not true, and it's impossible for us who are created by a God with meaning to think about the concept of there's no meaning, there's literally no good or evil. Some people try to maintain that, but nobody can actually live that way. but they'll pretend. Well, so I graduated, and so the goal is get a good job. I was an English major. I wanted to be a writer. Obviously, I did not get a good job. I floated, I drifted, and then I drifted and floated simultaneously, which can happen. And if you do those things just right, you know what happens. You will move back in with your parents, which is what I did. Now, if you move back in with your parents, I don't recommend it. But if your parents are working-class European immigrants who killed themselves at menial jobs so you could go to Yale University, you do not want to move back in with them. Because all my Yale friends would be like, their parents would be like, oh, Eric's finding himself. Oh, it's wonderful. He's finding himself. Christopher the Mill, he's going to be a writer. My parents would be like, yeah, we'd like you to find yourself a job and get out. And so it was a very harsh time for me. I can joke about it now, but it was really bleak. Into the midst of that unpleasant situation, I met a guy who started sharing his faith with me. And I was very hostile because at a place like Yale, you're trained to run from those crazy people because, they're basically nuts. And any nuts in the room? Anybody who actually believe the Bible and stuff like that? Because you're clearly insane and probably violent. So I avoided him, but I was in enough pain that I kept letting him kind of talk, and I was listening, and I realized I know nothing about what he's talking about. So it was at least fascinating. But one night, about a year into this period of pain, I had a dream, and I won't tell you the story now because we don't have the time, but God spoke to me in a dream. Now, you say, well, that's crazy. Well, trust me when I tell you, I thought it was crazy, except when it happens to you, you're kind of stuck. It's kind of like if you saw Bigfoot. You could say, oh, I don't want to have seen him, but I just saw him in the parking lot. He was huge, and he smelled very bad, and now I'm one of those people that has seen Bigfoot. And all my friends are going to make fun of me, but I can't shut up about it because I seen him. Well, that's kind of how I felt. I thought all of my friends who are agnostics, and they're just going to think Eric's flipped his wig. But what do you do if God actually speaks to you in a dream and you know that it wasn't your imagination? I tell the story on my website. There's a short video. I tell it in my book, Miracles. I've told the story. It's an outrageous dream. I can't take credit for it because I was unconscious at the time. Oh, no, really, I was unconscious. I was sleeping. And it's just one of those things, but it changed everything, and it launched me on this very strange career. As I say, I wanted to be a writer. I never wanted to write biographies. I'm far too self-centered to want to focus on some other person for 2 or 3 years. But I never thought I would write children's books. I ended up working for VeggieTales, as was mentioned. Now, some of you might not know, I didn't do it. I didn't exactly invent VeggieTales, but I had the privilege of writing half of Lyle the Kindly Viking. I wrote the Hamlet Omelet parody. I know you were wondering, who wrote that? I wrote that. And yeah, I even came up with that idea. And I didn't invent the idea of parody, though. There have been parodies for centuries. Just to be clear, but I did write that particular parody. And I had the privilege of being the voice of the narrator on the Esther video. Some of you seen the VeggieTales Esther video? No? Have you heard of Esther? Have you ever read any book? But anyway, so I had some crazy stuff, and then I ended up really strangely writing these biographies. And I promise you, this is what I believe, is that if you really trust God with your career, he'll take you in some really strange directions, And I never in a million years thought I would write biographies. And I certainly didn't think if I wrote the biographies that they would mean so much to me years later. But about 10 years ago, I was asked to write a biography of William Wilberforce. Some of you know this story. There was a movie called Amazing Grace. I wrote a biography to come out with the movie. And it's the story of a man who is most famous for having abolished the slave trade in the British Empire. It's an amazing story, but he did so much more than that. The movie can't go into it, but obviously in my book, I can go into everything that he did. I won't say it tonight. I spoke about it a little bit last night to a smaller group, but I will tell you, if you want proof that one person can go into a bleak cultural situation and dramatically change things, mainly by being a catalyst, because each one of us affects everyone around us, whether you like it or not. You do. What you do and say affects people around you. That should scare you, or it could inspire you. But the point is, it's a reality. You can't escape it. Your kids are watching you. That's the scariest thing of all. I recommend you live most of your life in the garage hiding from your kids, because whatever they see, they can use against you. And we don't need that. But the reality is that Wilberforce did a number of things. He had a dramatic conversion experience himself. And I think when you really believe God is calling you to do something, it kind of changes things, takes away the fear. Or if you don't believe in God, at least you believe something is right and true, you will do it. Well, Wilberforce came to see that the slave trade was an abomination, to use an old-fashioned word. It was a monstrous evil in the British Empire. And he knew that he ought to stay in politics and do all he could to lead this battle to abolish the slave trade. And it was impossible. But he felt, this is right, and if I do what is right, God will be with me. But he did so much else. That's just the tip of the iceberg of social rot at the time of his life. The entirety of Great Britain was a broken pagan culture where people didn't give a damn about the poor. Think about that. Today, liberals and conservatives argue about how to help the poor. Imagine living in a world where no one cares how to help the poor. Everyone agrees the poor can rot. They deserve to be poor, and I deserve not to be poor. Imagine that worldview. That's not the worldview you get from the Bible. But many countries and many people that say they're Christians or whatever are clearly not. It's just a label, and it's a mockery, ultimately. But Wilberforce goes into that situation and dramatically changes everything. It's a story I recommend to you only because it will inspire you, because it is true, and not many Americans, not many people at all really know the story. And it's one of the most astounding stories in history, that an entire culture that was broken, that was riddled with social ills, was turned in a few decades, turned around about as dramatically as anything you can imagine. So much so that a spirit of helping others and all these kinds of things became part of that culture and really leapt across the Atlantic and touched us here in the United States. You don't think that, we are, just because we happen to be Americans, that we're somehow generous people. If you think that, you're kidding yourself, kids. All people in the world are the same. It is what you learn in your culture, what becomes the thing to do. Wilberforce said his goal was to make goodness fashionable. Think about that. Now, imagine if it was the fashion to give away a lot of money, to spend a lot of time helping people. That was the fashion. It's what everybody did. Social pressure works that way. You compare yourself, right? For us, it's something really stupid like, who's got the best Christmas lights? You know who you are. You need to stop that. But I mean, Wilberforce said, I want to make goodness fashionable. I want people in Great Britain, especially people with money, to think about how can we outdo each other in being good, not in being bad. The leading figure in that land, who ultimately becomes King George IV. He was the Prince of Wales at this time. King George III was still on the throne. He was famous. This is grotesque to say, but I say it to give you a metric by which to judge that culture. The most famous figure in the land, the man who would be king, the man who would become the defender of the faith, quote unquote, was famous for having had 7,000, how shall we put it, girlfriends? Yeah. I mean, after 3,000, honestly, what's the point? Let's be honest. But can you imagine that this was the most famous person, and he was famous for that? And people in Parliament and wealthy people were famous for being drunken and gambling. It's the cool thing. They didn't use the word cool, but the point is, Wilberforce said, I've got to make goodness fashionable. And so he set the standard. And so each one of us has an ability to set the standard, to say, I'm going to do this. Wilberforce spent every Sunday with his wife and 6 kids, wrestling on the lawn. Trust me when I tell you, if you spend time with your kids, it's because Wilberforce started a trend. That trend did not exist before Wilberforce. Men didn't spend time with their children. That was women's work, or that was for somebody else. Wilberforce spent time with his wife and his kids, especially every Sunday. It set a fashion in England. Mr. Wilberforce does that. If you understand the influence you have, again, it should scare you, and then it should inspire you. Because he did the right thing with his time and his money, people saw that. So that's a very important story, and it's an important story because he was wildly successful. Great Britain becomes absolutely a model of charity, of people giving back. It's not something that existed before. We in the West seem to think like, well, everybody always has a social conscience, right? No. Before Wilberforce, the concept that I should give back did not exist. I want you to think about that. Every good atheist and agnostic in the West knows that they should give back. They might not know why, but the point is goodness has become fashionable as far as that goes. How are you doing here in the Permian Basin on that? I don't know. I don't live here. And by the way, I've never lived in a basin before. What is it like? It sounds like the Marianas Trench. Are you going to be okay? It's incredible. But anyway, the idea that Wilberforce lived out changed millions and millions of lives. It caught on all through Europe and the United States, such that we've never gone back. In over 200 years, we have this idea. Well, I want to tell you a little bit about the story of Luther and how that ties into a uniquely American idea of what we're talking about. The Luther book just came out. My arm was twisted to write it. Writing biographies is not easy, but I was convinced by some friends. The president of the King's College, some of you know, in New York City where I live, I'm a senior fellow and lecturer at large at the King's College. It's specifically Christian college in Manhattan, and it is one of the most amazing institutions. You want to talk about, what one person or what one institution can do for a whole region. I don't know where we'd be without the King's College. It is amazing that in a hyper-secular environment like Manhattan, we have the King's College. And the president of that college I dedicate my Luther book to him. He convinced me that I need to tell the story of Luther. He said, you told about the story about Wilberforce. You told the story about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Eric, you're the guy to do this. And I said, no, thank you. And I'll have fries. And literally, that's what I said. And we weren't even in a restaurant. Imagine that. So I remember him saying, no, you don't understand, because Greg Thornberry is a real genius. That's why he's the president of a college. And he was explaining to me the significance of Luther. I never quite understood that Luther really was, apart from Jesus of Nazareth, in the last 2,000 years, I would argue that he was the most influential person in history. By doing what he did, it led to everything we have today, our freedoms, everything we pretty much either take for granted or cherish, but the whole modern world, it begins with Luther. So he convinced me to write the story of Luther, and really what convinced me was that Luther is a very entertaining figure, very, very funny in many ways, a real maniac in some ways, a wild man. And so it's a very entertaining story, and I think history can be fun, and it's nice when it's fun, and I thought it would be more fun to write a fun story than a non-fun story. What do you think? As a thesis, right? So the story of Luther in a nutshell is simply that he was born around 1483. We literally don't know the year, and I always say that we even didn't know, this is true, even his mother didn't know the year he was born, and everybody knows she was nearby when it happened. You can't get around that, okay? But somehow even she didn't know, they didn't know, but he was born on November 10th, and raised in, there's many, many myths in the Luther story, and in my book I debunk many of them without intending to. I just go to tell the story, and then I start noticing that all this stuff that I have read is kind of mythical and legendary, and the reality is quite different. Oftentimes, in fact, I was just speaking at a church in Houston, it was in Dallas, about 6 weeks ago when the book first came out, and they had big slides, facts about Luther before I gave my talk. And one of them it talks about Luther grew up in a very poor family, blah, 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 blah. And then in the course of my talk, not having seen the slides, I said, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard, because it's clear that he didn't grow up in a poor family. And of course, that night in bed, my wife said, honey, there were some slides you didn't realize, but you may have insulted your host. Well, let me just say, everybody says, and Luther himself said, that he grew up the son of a poor miner. Well, that's kind of like a politician, kind of burnishing his street cred, He was born a son of a poor. The reality with Luther, and this is quite important to the story, is that he grew up in a rather well-off family. They weren't wealthy, but his father was a successful businessman, an ambitious and successful businessman in the mining business. So Luther grew up with everything he could have needed. He was not noble, he was not wealthy, but apart from that, he was very comfortable. And his father wanted him to go to study at the university, so he sends him off to all these schools to learn Latin and, just the finest of everything, and he goes to the University of Erfurt. And his father wanted him to study the law because he wanted him to come back to Mansfeld, come back home, and help in the family business. And of course, with a law degree, it would be extraordinary. But while Luther was in law school, he had just begun law school, he takes a trip home for the weekend. I think it was Thanksgiving. And I'm just going to keep using that stupid joke until people realize Thanksgiving didn't exist in Germany in 1505. Man. So he goes home for some reason. I don't know why he goes home. But on his way back to the university to continue his law studies that he just began, he encounters a horrible, horrible thunderstorm. Now, in a flat place like the Permian Basin, maybe you have stuff like this where you really think you're going to die. It comes right on top of you, and you think, I'm going to get struck. And he was convinced he was going to die. And in a moment of abject terror, he cries out to St. Anne, who is the patron saint of miners, and says, St. Anne, save me. If you save me, I'll become a monk. He does not die, and then he thinks, well, I've made a vow, I must become a monk. That's another one of these myths that makes it sound like he just kind of blurts this thing out, and then it shapes the whole rest of his life. The reality is, Luther and everyone in that era, okay, around 1500, they were thinking deeply about salvation, and there was a general sense that God is a fearsome, unpleasant judge who wants to send you to hell. And you must perform. Some of us still have this idea. I hope you don't go to a church that teaches that, but some of us get this idea that you better jump through these hoops, you better not do this, don't do this, don't do this again. You got to earn your way into God's love. Now, that idea is an idea out of the pit of hell, and many people have put it forth as somehow this is what the Bible says. It is in fact not. But Luther lived at a time when the church was this monolithic, extraordinarily powerful institution. And the reality was most people believed something like that. And if you feared stepping into eternity and stepping into hell eternally, you took these ideas very seriously. And Luther, being a very intense person, took them seriously, and he was thinking about this all the time. Some of his friends died. It must have been on his mind. So when he's walking through this horrible thunderstorm, he thinks this is it. It all comes to a head. He makes a decision. That's it. I will not risk my salvation, become a lawyer, and who knows? I don't know what's going to happen. I'm going to go with monastery. I'm going to go. I know that's the one thing I can do to become a priest. It's the safest thing I can do. Because there was this idea, which again exists long after Luther. It exists in Texas and in New York where I live. Some people have this idea that, priests or whatever are holier, right? Now, you're not supposed to see it that way. The Bible says that we're all children of God and that we can all live out our faith and live out our lives wherever God puts us. Wilberforce stayed in politics, for example. But in Luther's day, that idea practically was non-existent. So he becomes a monk, becomes a priest, and then gets on this treadmill of, I've got to pray hard, I've got to fast, I've got to do everything I can possibly do, in effect, to earn my way to heaven. Now, if you've ever tried to earn your way to heaven, you will discover, if you do it really well, you'll discover that it's not possible. It's like trying to pay an infinite debt. The harder you work, the more miserable you are, and you haven't scratched the surface of infinity. Luther finds himself in this situation. He ultimately is so miserable that he starts reading the Bible, which no one in those days was really studying. Now, we need to be clear. This is 1510, and that period, there were no Bibles hanging around. The printing press had just been invented. So it was a rare thing to be able to study the Bible. Luther taught the Bible at the University of Wittenberg, so he was probably more than anybody on the planet familiar with the Bible, and he starts digging in there, looking for perhaps there's a golden key in this book someplace that we have largely neglected. Perhaps in here someplace is the answer to this conundrum. Everybody wants to have peace with God. Every tribe since the beginning of humanity has said something's wrong. We need to do something. We need to have some rituals. Every human being since the beginning of time has been involved in some kind of tribal religious activity. And it was no different with Luther. He's thinking, there is a gulf between me and God. I don't have peace. I don't feel good. What's wrong? What can I do? And all the praying and confessing and fasting wasn't doing anything. Maybe someplace in the Bible he could find a key. And around 1517, we're celebrating the 500th anniversary of his nailing the thesis on indulgences, which is a little bit separate. But around the same time, he discovers this magic passage. And I would argue that it is this exquisite thing in this book of Holy Scripture that really is the key to everything. What does he find? He finds that according to the Bible, which people had been reading very carefully for a few centuries, he finds that God loves us. He does not hate us. And as he has given us the gift of his own righteousness. In other words, you can never earn peace with God on your own. It'd be like trying to swim to Hawaii. Everybody drowns. Don't try it. I'm telling you, trust me, you won't make it. He suddenly realizes nobody makes it, but according to the Bible, it says that if I have faith in God, if I put my trust in him, he has me covered. If I understand that he paid the debt 15 centuries ago, if I apprehend that and accept it, he gives me this gift of his righteousness, of peace, of all these kinds of things. I'm not here to give a sermon, but the point is that this was something in history that changed everything. Because from this moment on, first of all, Luther understands the fundamental idea of the whole Bible is that rather than try to earn your way into peace with God, you need to accept the fact that God already paid the price so that you could have peace with him. All you need to do is acknowledge that he has given you this free gift, and the gift is yours. So from that moment on, if you recognize that, you're filled with gratitude, and you want to spend the rest of your life doing good things in gratitude for what has already been done for you. This is the key. This is so simple. But imagine thinking, I have to earn God's love. It would make you hate God because you would do everything, and never feel you get there. Luther lived that out, and then in his misery, he dives into the Bible and discovers we've been doing it all wrong. That's not what it says. What are we doing? It says that he loves us. He does not hate us, and we are to love him. And so if you apprehend that somebody has already paid the debt, and you don't ever need to think about adding a penny, it's done, your only proper response is gratitude. And to say, God, you love me? Even though I have done all these bad things and I haven't done all these good things, you still love me? When Luther understood this, it turned everything inside out. He now understands he can lead the rest of his life in joyous gratitude to God, doing good to others as a response to what God has already done for him. Not doing good to others to earn his way into the good graces of God. Not writing a check to earn his way into the good graces of God, but to write a check and to do good to others and to love your neighbor as a way of thanking God for what he already did for you. That is at the very heart of history. If you want to know how you get to American liberty and all the things that we have, it began there. So Luther now, armed with this information, thinks, hey, it's kind of like being a low man on the totem pole at Exxon, and you want to tell the higher-ups, I've noticed a problem down here. They're going to thank me. Oh, they're going to thank me. Well, Luther finds out on this little sidebar thing, he does this thing on the indulgences. It was not an angry posting. If you know the story of Luther and the Indulgences, October 31st, 1517, he nails these 95 theses to the wall, to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. We remember it as this angry moment that this monk is furious at the church, and he writes out his complaints, and he nails this thing where? Where can I put it to just be a sharp stick in the Pope's eye? I know, I'm going to put it on the church door. And he nails it to the church door with a hammer, loud. And then you do the research like I did for my book, and you realize, oh yeah, the church door, that was the local bulletin board. So it really wasn't that dramatic. It has all the drama of getting a couple of push pins and going down to the laundry room and you know, my cat is lost, and you know, you put a thing up there. It had all the drama of I want to offer guitar lessons. You put it up there like that. It doesn't have a lot of drama. But in retrospect, we remember it as this outrageous moment. It was not. But what it did is it was like a spark that set off a conflagration that all these things, and at the heart of it, this main thing that I just shared about who God is and how we are to respond to what he has done for us, we are to respond to his love. He loves us first. We can't earn his love. Never, never. When Luther really puts this together and starts sharing this, all hell breaks loose. He's misunderstood. He tries to explain himself rather humbly. He was not some firebrand. But I don't know if it's ever happened to you. You try to explain yourself and you dig the hole deeper. Any husbands in the room? I'm just curious. Anybody? That's just one of the things that can happen. And it gets worse and worse. Things got worse and worse until he's finally excommunicated. And, which is a bad thing in case you didn't know that. And in 1521, he is summoned to the city of Worms, Germany. We say worms. And in Texas, I think you say night crawlers, right? Worms. He's summoned to the city to give an account. Really, he thought he was being summoned to give an account, and he hoped that he would get to explain what he had discovered and why he had said what he had said. Because once he discovered this idea changes everything. It affects everything. And he prayed that he would get an opportunity to explain it to these incredibly powerful men in the room. But they were not interested in his explanation. They summoned him into the room. And this is one of these moments from history, 1521, 4 years after he nails the theses. He walks into a room filled with 300 of the most powerful men on the planet and the richest men on the planet. He walks into this room, a humble monk, and they basically say to him, "Are these your books? Yes or no?" "Yes." "Do you recant what you've written in these books? Yes or no?" He thought, well, I know what they want. They want me to sign on the dotted line. You just shut up, say, "I'm sorry, I recant," and you can walk out of here, no problem. Everything's fine. But he said, I can't do that. Because once you recognize the reality of God, not the theory of God, but if you know God is real, you fear God more than you fear what people can do to you. That's one of the good reasons everybody should know God personally. It kind of gives you a little courage. Luther knew that if he were to tell them what they wanted to hear in that room to save his skin, he would betray the truth. And to betray the truth, history and God will judge you forever if you do not speak the truth. You've been summoned into this room to speak something. And what happened that day, and this is a big moment, at the Diet of Worms that day in 1521, he basically says to the arrayed power and wealth in that room that there is a thing called truth. It exists independent of you all. Now, he didn't put it that way. That would have been cheeky and rude. He didn't say that. But effectively, that is what he said. He said there's such a thing as truth. What the scriptures, the word of God says is true. What is true is true. That can never change. And if you in this room have the power to kill me because I'm not agreeing with your version of the truth, you can kill me, but the truth can't change. And by doing what he did that day, he effectively separated truth and power forever. So that today, we understand the idea of truth is sacrosanct. Powers cannot tell us what is true. If you go to North Korea, they will tell you what is true. But in the West today, we understand truth exists apart from what the powerful say. The powerful might be right, but they might be wrong. And now every single one of us is responsible for what is true. We can't just say, well, the church said, or well, the government said, I have to go to this church on Sunday morning. We are now freed from the tyranny of that kind of a life, and we have the scary thing called freedom to choose. Is that really true? Just because someone insists upon it doesn't make it true. It might be true, but what if they're wrong? Do I not have a responsibility to speak up? What Luther did in 1521 effectively cracked medieval Christendom and medieval Europe in half, and out of the crack flew what we call the future. The world in which we live came out of that moment. The ideas of freedom that we have, that we take for granted, let's face it, folks, we take it for granted. What we have is an inestimable treasure that most of the world never had. Certainly never had until that moment. And most people in the world today do not have that. Try to tell the leaders in China what is true, how you think you should be able to worship, what you should be able to do with your money. They say, well, it's not your money, it belongs to the state. Luther, for the first time in the history of the world, brought the ideas of the gospel, of the Bible, into history so that they never left. One of those ideas, which I've touched on, is the idea that we're all equal in God's eyes. The king, the duke, the archbishop, and we are all exactly equal. I don't have to accept what they say is true. In God's eyes, we're equal. Now, if that is the case, that means that the duke and the king and the archbishop and even the pope are all accountable to God, just as I am. That's an extraordinary moment in history because it leads inevitably to the Pilgrims looking for religious liberty, saying that just because King James says we have to do this, no, we don't. We would rather die or suffer than be forced to accept what an authority figure has told us about what we know is not right. Persecute us, kill us. We have to live for what is true. They were persecuted. We forget. We think the Pilgrims just ate turkey. They didn't. They were horribly persecuted, so horribly that they left England to go to Holland. I would never go to Holland. That's just, any Dutch people here? I hate the Dutch. I hate you. No, I don't. But they were horribly persecuted, but they, only 100 years after Luther and many others, had taken in this new idea that truth is truth and I have to be faithful to what is true. That leads to religious liberty. It leads to the idea enshrined in the American Constitution, which we should treasure because it is so rare and so fragile and so extraordinary. The idea that people are truly free to believe what they like. Now that should scare us again, because you can believe stupid things or you can believe good things. You're free. The government will not force you. A church cannot force you to worship God correctly or to know what is true. You have freedom. That freedom that came into the world as a result of this stubborn monk, Martin Luther, changes everything, and it gives each of us not only the ability to do whatever we like and think whatever we like, but it gives us the outrageous responsibility and the duty to do what is right. You can't do what is wrong and say, well, I'm only doing it because he told me. I'm only doing it because the law tells me I have to do this. History now says, and God says, you do what is right. Some laws are not right. You don't listen to the law, you listen to what is true. That, folks, is the engine of freedom. It changed the world. It led to what we have in this country. And if you ever doubted whether faith and virtue are related to freedom, all you have to think about is the founders' idea of self-government. I write about it in my book, If You Can Keep It. And by the way, I meant to say, Patrick, it means so much to me that book found its way into your hands and led to a conversation that has led to this, and that this will lead to so much else beyond this, because this is meant only to be a beginning. But these ideas, we have forgotten these ideas, just as the men in Luther's time forgot about the ideas of the gospel. We have forgotten about the ideas of our founding. These ideas are so crucial, we cannot forget them. And what they are, in a nutshell, I just said it, is freedom and virtue, or freedom and faith, are related. My friend Os Guinness, to whom I dedicate my book, If You Can Keep It, puts it this way. He calls it the golden triangle of freedom. When I heard this, I could not believe that I'd never heard this before. I was ashamed, and I'm hoping to shame you now, because it'll make me feel better. But seriously, this is one of the most remarkable things. When you hear this, you say, I want to share this with the world because it's so amazing. Basically, the founders, every one of the founders, everyone, Franklin, Jefferson, all of them understood this concept. Self-government, true liberty, true freedom, which we call self-government, requires people to govern themselves. That sounds like a tautology. Think about it for a second. Self-government means you are required to govern yourself. No one will hold a gun to you to force you to do the right thing. You will do the right thing. Self-government means we do the right thing when nobody's looking. We pay our taxes. We don't commit crimes. We do the right thing without oversight. Now, why would the founders entrust a population to do that when it had never been done in the history of the world? It's because the people in the 13 colonies understood some of these things that I'm talking about. George Whitefield was preaching what Luther had brought into the world up and down the 13 colonies for decades, saturating them with this unique concept. It became like an American creed, the idea that there is no king. We can govern ourselves. We can be free. We only answer to God. That's a unique concept. And so the founders understood that in order for people to govern themselves, they have to have some measure of virtue. Otherwise, you need guns, you need a huge police force, they need oversight. You need a bureaucracy or a tyranny to govern them. Self-government means no. They will do it on their own because they have virtue. And many of the founders wrote explicitly about the connection between virtue and freedom. You will never have this kind of freedom unless you have a people of virtue. And then they said, virtue arises more often than not from faith. That's a simple fact. It doesn't mean the only virtuous people are people of faith, but they observed that where there was religious revival in the colonies, those people governed themselves, crime went down, alcoholism went down, magic happened every time. Franklin wrote about it. So they came up with this concept, which my friend Os Guinness calls the golden triangle of freedom. Freedom, or self-government, requires virtue. Virtue, in turn, requires faith. But here's the key. Faith, in turn, requires freedom. In other words, real faith must be free. If it is coerced, if the government says, you must go to that church, you must be Protestant, you must be Catholic, you must be atheist, you must go along with this view. If the government does that, there's no true freedom of religion, and religion and virtue will not flourish. Virtue was not flourishing in Luther's day. Whenever it is coerced, people get cynical. It becomes pro forma, it just becomes what you do. You go through the motions, but your heart isn't in it because you're not living it. You don't really know, is it true? All I know is to stay out of trouble, I need to do this. The founders saw that for the first time in the history of the world, think about this, folks, a people might be able to govern themselves. Might. Benjamin Franklin was asked on the way out of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us, a monarchy or a republic? They actually didn't know whether, after 4 years of trying, from 1783 to 1787, it wasn't working so good. Some of you heard about Shays' Rebellion. They couldn't collect taxes. It wasn't working. They go back to the drawing board, Independence Hall, to try to create a constitution, a government. Can they do it? They might have come out of the room and said, it can't work. It's not going to work. We need to have a soft monarchy. It'll be better. Our king will be George Washington. It won't be a tyranny, but it'll be a soft monarchy. So this woman, Mrs. Powell, actually asks Franklin, what have you given us, Dr. Franklin, a monarchy or a republic? He shoots back, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. He knew that if you, the people, do not keep the republic, if you do not live this out, the Constitution is worth nothing. It is a bunch of marks on a piece of paper. It does nothing. If you understand what it says and you live it out, if you are people of virtue and faith who cherish your freedom and live out your freedom with responsibility, everything is possible. But Franklin had no clue whether it would work. He said, if you can keep it, because I think he was very wise and he understood this has never been done before in the history of the world. But something unique happened because the ideas of Luther, freedom of religion, and faith as a response to the love of God, as a joyous response to the love of God, not as a horrible burden. But that kind of faith could do all kinds of things. It would create a free market, which would create wealth. It would create opportunity. It would enable people of means to lift up those who are suffering. And people who know the Bible understand that God commands us to help those who can't help themselves, that we're supposed to do something. These are unique ideas, but they were unleashed into history by Martin Luther and then by the people who followed him. I mentioned George Whitefield, enshrined in the Constitution. So we stand today, folks, at a moment where I would say for the last 40 years, we've not been teaching these ideas. I didn't learn this in school. I went to good public schools. I didn't learn this stuff. And then when I went to college, I was actively taught against these ideas. We're living at a time where the pop culture is not talking about these things. The founders, every one of them understood that if we the people don't get this stuff, if we don't know this and own it and live it, if we don't keep it, it goes away. And my thesis is that it's been going away. And then we have a moment to understand where we are in history and to understand that we have a responsibility to history and to the future to live out this idea. And what it looks like in a place like this means that you say, in order to govern myself, I need to do something. If I want to live in a place where I am governed, I need to do nothing except stay out of trouble. But if I want to govern myself, that requires me to do something. Now, what you do, that's up to you. But I can say, as a Christian, God wants us to live our lives that way. Now, I can speak to us just as Americans. America and freedom don't work without this. But speaking as a Christian, I would say, God says, I have only blessed you to be a blessing. You need to know that. If you have money, if you have the ability to make money, if you have energy, if you have intelligence, if you have beauty, if you have charm, whatever you have, I have blessed you with it, not just for you. Remember how much he loves us. So he doesn't say, oh, I don't care about you. He loves you, but he says, but I've blessed you to be a blessing. That idea is at the heart of what made America, America. We didn't just flower just because. It's because of these ideas. And we kept teaching these ideas to our young people. I would argue again that the last 40 or so years, we have stopped teaching these ideas. We need to understand that it only works that way. Now, you all here could be a model community if you were to embrace these ideas, understand them, and understand that without this, it all goes away. it all goes away. It doesn't matter how much fossil fuels are under the ground, folks. It's all going to go away. You could have no freedom. There are many wealthy places in the world where they have no freedom. So we have a charge to keep. When Benjamin Franklin said, if you can keep it, he was speaking to history. I think he would have been amazed that we've kept it this long. But I would say to you, we ought to only be beginning until the whole world has what we have, the freedoms that we have. You understand, John Winthrop, in quoting Jesus, and then Reagan quoting Winthrop, talked about a shining city on a hill. We in America, we're to be that shining city. We're to be the example to the world of what freedom can look like. Why? Because we want the whole world to say, yes, I want that. And we want the whole world to have it. We want to so flourish that we can share these freedoms with the whole world and help the whole world to see what we don't deserve to see, but what we have been blessed to see. That's really why we have everything that we do. You're in a unique position in this community to shine like many parts of this country cannot shine. So I hope this evening will be a beginning where you'll get that. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Metaxas. Just a couple of things before we begin our conversation on stage, and that is, we really encourage you to ask questions tonight. And on the backs of your programs, you'll see a text number. Just fire away at that text number if you have a question for Eric and Mr. Pat Canty, publisher of the Odessa American and my compatriot on the Basin PBS board. We'll take your question, and we really want to see a few of those. So without further ado, as Aerosmith used to say, I'll walk this way back to my seat. And turn on my mic.
We're on? We're on.
Okay. First question. And
But I should say I prefer true or false questions.
True. Is it true that, okay, in a couple of places in your books, and I haven't read them all yet, but I did see in If You Can Keep It, this book right here, that you describe our situation in America as fairly grave. You say, well, you know, we're in kind of deep stuff, and you just talked about it a little bit in the conclusion of your remarks. But, you know, others might say that perhaps there have been gray periods in our history,
right.
like, you know, we went through the Civil War.
Yeah.
That tore us apart as a nation.
Yeah.
We've been through this, that, and the other. What about our current situation makes you say that it's so grave? And realizing that many of us, you know, we're not old souls. We're just folks that we identify mostly with what we've experienced in life, and our grasp of history may not be what it should be.
Yeah.
For example, in the 60s, in the long, hot summer of 1967, there were no fewer than 159 race riots in this country, and many cities nearly burned to the ground. Well, to me, that was a pretty grave situation.
Yeah.
So what about our current times that makes you say that, well, you know, it's pretty bad?
I think it's kind of like, you know, if you run out of gas and you're on fumes, you understand that you're not going to be on fumes long. And I would argue that culturally speaking, as bad as things were in the 60s, we still had cultural capital. We still had money in the bank. We still had gas in the tank. We still believed as a people in certain things, and we had been communicating those things. In the 40 or 50 years since then, the 50 years since that summer, I really think we've not been teaching these basic ideas. And so it's kind of Os Guinness, whom I quote endlessly, and I dedicate my book, If You Can Keep It, to him, since I stole most of the ideas in it from him. But Os Guinness talks about a cut flower society. You look at everything looks fine, but the flower is cut, it is dying. We're in a cut flower society. We've been cut off from our roots. Everything still looks fine, but any minute it will begin not to look fine. I don't think you can compare where we were 50 years ago. I mean, I see where we are now as an existential crisis. I believe that just like in the Civil War, just like in the Revolutionary War, we can win and will win, but it's a fight. If we don't remind ourselves of a number of the things that I just talked about and the things that I talk about, and if you can keep it, I think we're dead. Like, you cannot, Franklin made it really clear, and all the founders understood that everybody has to get this. You can disagree on all kinds of stuff, but you must get these basics. We have not been teaching these basics. We can argue about stuff. That's different from misunderstanding the main things that have pulled us together. I mean, your average kid in 1950 or 1940 or 1930, you were being taught patriotic poems, Longfellow. It was just part of American culture. In the 60s, that went away. We are dealing with that now, that if you have 40 or 50 years where you're not teaching people a modicum of love of country and of why we're exceptional. We're exceptional because God wants to bless the whole world through us, not just to bless us. If you don't teach those ideas, they just, the whole thing evaporates. I mean, I'm fundamentally convinced it's like math. It's pretty simple. We haven't been teaching this stuff for a couple of generations.
I'm not sure why that many people shy away from this notion of American exceptionalism, other than to say perhaps that they believe that, we're trying to be better than other citizens of the world.
Well, because it
like
implies
a Frenchman or
people.
German,
Yeah, people misunderstand the
it's
concept of it. I mean,
very
and I actually talk about this in If You Can Keep It, because if you think American exceptionalism means we're better, we are not better. We're exactly the same. We have just as much original sin as every nationality on the planet, possible exception of France, but I don't want to go into that now because I don't have a lot of time.
Of course.
But I guess my point is that it is these ideas that were bequeathed to us that have enabled us to do great things. We didn't invent these ideas. These are a gift, and we have the ability to share these ideas. In fact, I would say it's incumbent on us to share these ideas, to spread freedom around the world, to spread these ideas, human rights ideas, around the whole world. That's what makes us exceptional. But the point is, it doesn't belong to us. It's been loaned to us to share with the whole world. And so we have to hold our exceptionalism lightly. What is exceptional? The ideas are exceptional. We are just as bad as anybody else.
Yeah. Well, perhaps our system of government certainly is exceptional, because out of the 196 countries in the world, there are 11 constitutional republics. We're the oldest, so we have stood the test of time.
That's right.
But I believe that maybe there's a crisis, especially with younger people, in knowing, because you can't really love something that you don't know, right? And you don't know it, then it's just infatuation. You could say, you need to love your country. Well, I don't really know too much about it.
No,
so
that's the issue. That's exactly
order
right.
Is to teach and welcome your thoughts on well, for example, our mutual friend, one of our mutual friends is Janine Turner. She teaches the Constitution now, right. Left her career behind as an actress, and her sole mission in life is to teach young people the Constitution of the United States, which I think is very admirable. And we do some teaching too, but it's certainly a drop in the bucket compared to what is needed, so that a young person can then know and be familiar with history and concepts, and then say, I really respect, and then I love, and then I possibly will defend.
Well, I feel as a writer, I'm mainly a writer, the way that the way that I do anything is I write to communicate. And so I wrote the book, If You Can Keep It, specifically with the idea of wanting to get these ideas in this book into the hands of as many people as possible. Because I think the way I present them, they're such inspiring ideas that your average person doesn't just go, oh, that's interesting. I think you want to do something about it. In other words, if you have a good teacher or you have it presented in the right way, people just say, gee, that's exciting. It's not just information. Suddenly they realize what they have. I think what I try to communicate in the book, If You Can Keep It, is that what we have is an extraordinary treasure. It's like somebody gives you an extraordinary treasure, incredibly fragile, and you have no idea what it is. If you see what you have, you think, oh my gosh, and you want to take care of it. I really think that's the point of my writing that book. I talk about it wherever I can, but I really think that, it's up to people to say, we need to teach this to our kids. There's no doubt about it. There's no substitute.
Yeah. We're going to bounce around a little bit with the questioning, because part of tonight is to talk about the topics that you know and love so well, and we do too, and that's Americanism, but also we have this initiative that starting and changing our conversation with our two cities. So it's kind of like intersecting planes, I have to say that because I'm academic, so they told me to say something about education.
Intersecting planes,
together.
right.
Okay. But having said that is...
Do they meet in a line?
Yeah, I don't know. I never see them when they intersect. I see them when they take off.
That's right.
And they land and everything,
man.
But our movement, so to speak, might risk to be considered as some type of kumbaya where, we want to feel good together. And it's really not the case. We already feel good together. I mean, we're two cities that work closely together on a lot of issues. But isn't it true that we should be looking at being more specific, therefore, in the areas of focus that we want to cooperate mutually in, so we can pick one. And you can't go out and it's like going out and saying, well, I want world peace. You're not going to have. You have to put your little grain, your little nugget on the hill, and so forth, so that you actually can make a little progress
I would start,
together.
The one thing that I have heard a couple of times, I can't remember who said it to me, but that educationally, that the public schools here are near the bottom in terms of rankings. Who can disagree with the idea that we must do something about that? I mean, you cannot allow a place loaded with wealth that people dream about to allow that. It's just wrong. It's morally wrong. You can't do that. So the question is how? Now, the how is more complicated. I would argue, honestly, that it's not just about teaching math or whatever. The stuff that I talk about in my book, If You Can Keep It, to me, that's the core. You've got to get people excited. You've got to get people inspired. I would say you could start there. You could start with these ideas, and there's so many books on the subject. But I think that if you start just there, if you say we want to communicate these ideas to the school kids in this area, do you understand you're going to be light years ahead of the rest of this country? Because this is it is the most important thing. If you have a group of young people who get this stuff, stuff will happen. There's no question about it. And imagine, again, for 40 or so years, we've not been teaching this. Try to find public schools that are teaching this. And every time I write something like this book, I don't write it for conservatives or liberals. I write it for everybody. And I have my friend Dick Cavett, who is a very liberal atheist, loved the book. And I thought, I've succeeded, because these ideas are for every American. These ideas are not meant to divide. But I think to be excited about your country for the right reasons is really important.
We truly do need to start in education. I think there's a lot of people who would agree with that. And many years ago, there was a lawyer here in Odessa by the name of Wes Burnett, and he had to go give some testimony in Austin. You know Austin.
Yes, I do.
That other place down there. As to the need for a university here in this area. Now we have the University of Texas Permian Basin. So they asked him, he said, well, do you think there's enough need educationally for a 4-year school? He says, well, heck, there's so much ignorance up there in Odessa, we can take an 8-year school. 8-year school.
That's funny. That is very funny. Yes.
So and now, of course, we have great schools, we have great higher education, but like most communities, we struggle with the K-12 a little bit.
Sure.
So I want to bounce back a little bit now to this is a topic of Americanism in general. And that is,
before I lose it, I was just going to say one thing. For example, I always think in terms of churches, right? But churches could just pick a school and volunteer to tutor kids for free. I mean, something like that. It's totally doable. It would be a wonderful experience for everybody. It would show the love of God to people. You say, why are you doing this? Well, just because I think I should, because I want to.
that would be incredible to do something like that. Those kinds of opportunities exist. Somebody just needs to take the leadership. But I think that's a kind of a small thing that you could do, and it's going to have a big effect.
Excellent. You've also stated that in America that we've fallen into a perpetual ideological battle, and that's of special interest to me in my own writing and research. And on the one hand, you have those people who think that everything's bad and it's never going to get any better. On the other hand, you have people who say, well, everything's good. And those two groupings seem to be accentuated now more than ever. Do you see those groupings falling out now along party lines, political party lines too, such that we have this crisis of not even getting to the place where we can forge compromise anymore?
Well, the first thing for me has to do with the fact that because I'm a Christian, I'm commanded to hope. Whenever I hear anybody being negative or saying, well, it's not worth doing anything, everything's broken, I just feel like that is the voice of the devil. That is not what God is saying. God says, you can do something. You can love your neighbor. You can tutor that kid for 3 hours a week. Just do that. Shut up and do that. Don't worry about the rest of the world falling apart. Do one thing. I have so many friends that have fallen into that, where they're negative and they're complaining about some people can't stop complaining about the president, and then you have other people who can't stop complaining about the people complaining about the president. And I have to say that, again, I'm speaking as a Christian, I am commanded to hope. I am commanded, the scripture commands me as a Christian, rejoice in the Lord always. Not when things are going well, not when there's a shale boom, not when the stock market is up, always. So if things are bad, somehow God is telling me I'm supposed to be part of the solution. And when I hear people complaining, I hear it from Christians, I hear it from everybody. I just want to say, I don't have time to explain, but I think it's the voice of the devil, or it might as well be. It is utterly destructive. People are in love with complaining and telling you why everything's broken. I would walk away from people if they continue to do that, because it affects everybody and it is not helping. If you really give a darn about those kids in these schools that are not doing so well, you don't complain. You just do something. Just do something. Complaining doesn't help. I obviously feel strongly about that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, the next question is on the topic of civility. And the other day I was walking down the street and I saw a bunch of people in a demonstration. They were chanting, "What do we want? Civility. When do we want it? Within a reasonable time frame."
That's very funny.
Within a reasonable.
It's also funny.
Well,
it's funny.
We don't. Obviously, we have problems with civility now, and
that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
That's true. That's true.
Stupid.
But again, it's one of those things that's misunderstood, because people equate civility with just being nice, just being polite. It is not that at all. It's very, very much deeper, and it involves truth-telling, because if I respect you and I want to be civil with you, then you need the whole truth, nothing but the truth, from me, don't you?
Right.
And so I think we're missing the boat there. It's kind of like the example of when President Kennedy went through the Bay of Pigs fiasco. It was groupthink all the way. They wanted the staff wanted him to, they wanted to tell him what they thought he wanted to hear. Groupthink. And then the reason why he was successful the following year in the Cuban Missile Crisis, because he said, "No, you're going to tell me the whole truth." And they were civil with him, and he prevailed in that instance. So
it's a balance. I think
today.
that in my book on Bonhoeffer, basically, you see an example of people unwilling to go against Hitler, many of them, because they were such gentlemen that they thought, well, we can't get involved in a plot against the head of state. We have to be civil. We have to be, in other words, civility, if it's misinterpreted, can be wrong. There's a time to fight. But we're not called to fight the way others fight. We're supposed to, having courage, standing up for truth, those things are important. But I really think we're at a time in the country where people don't understand the basics of this. And people are using foul language constantly. It's awful. All you can do is set an example, or don't let your kids do that. You just say, no, we don't do that here. We don't do that here. But the lack of civility on both sides, I've been, I'm upset that the president feels he has to punch every time somebody, throws shade at him, to use the latest cliche. I think that, but you can't look to him for perfection. I just think in our own lives, we have to model civility, and we have to say, let's sure. Disagree, but let's disagree in a civil way. It is important. There's a lot to say on that. I'm sorry to go on, but there's a lot that we could say on that.
Thank you. Let's see if we have an audience question. We really want to hear what the folks have for you.
When did he get in here? Hey, how are you? You snuck up on me.
I'm the other Patrick.
You snuck it. Yeah, I know.
So we're working on trying to increase our conversations between the two communities and work together. But, there's always going to be those that say not only no, but hell no.
Yeah.
And so one of our audience
You have capital
members,
punishment in Texas?
Yeah, yes.
'Cause some people just need shooting. You know how that is. Isn't that what they say? Some people just need killing. No, I think there are always going to be those people. So what do you...
The question is, what is the best way to use our influence toward those who do not wish to change?
I think that's actually a great question, because I think for some reason, many of us in America have bought into this idea that we've got to get everybody to agree with us. I think the best thing you can do with some people is absolutely ignore them. Do not respond. Do not argue with them. If somebody wants to be negative, let them have their little pity party alone. Don't try to argue them out of it. I think that can be a mistake. In Scripture, Jesus talks about casting pearls before swine. You need to know when it's not worth it. And I think that if somebody wants to be negative, you don't owe them an argument of why they're wrong. I think sometimes you just walk away. There are always going to be people like that, and I work hard to avoid them. If somebody says something negative or nasty to me on Twitter, I don't mute them. I block them instantly. Because I say, this is not, when you get in a back and forth with people, it inevitably leads in a bad direction. And I think that studied avoidance of those folks is actually the best way to bless them.
Okay, good. We got quite a number of questions from, it looks like, students tonight. And so you've been there, done that, got the T-shirt, going to a secular university. And what advice do you have for the Christian students in the secular universities of America today?
Yeah.
How do they go about handling all that and dealing with it?
Well, the same thing that I say to people just living out in the world today. One thing I've noticed about Christians is that Christians are so civil and so nice that they end up being cowards. You have to have the ability to speak the truth and not be ashamed of it. Don't apologize for your faith. It's kind of like everybody's starving. You've got food, and you go, I'm really sorry that I have food and that I want to share it with you. I apologize. Am I offending you? If somebody is starving and they're so insane that they're offended that you're offering them food, that's really their issue. I think that when you are lovingly sharing the truth, or sharing the truth as you understand it, that is what America is all about. And I think Christians have self-censored themselves and say, well, I don't want to bring that up. I can't bring that up in school. Yes, you can bring it up in school. And shame on you if you don't bring it up in school. Now, if you bring it up like a jerk, that's bad. But to bring something up, to live out your faith, the founders gave us religious liberty, not freedom of worship, okay? They've got freedom of worship in China. You go into that building, you do your little weird ritual. When you come out, you bow to the secular authority of the state. That's freedom of worship. We have freedom of religion. We have religious liberty, which means that you are allowed to exercise your faith 24/7 in the marketplace, in the grocery store. And if people have a problem with that, you've got to understand that is their problem. the idea that we say, well, I don't want people to be offended. If I'm really, really nice,
Right.
maybe they'll agree with me. That doesn't work. And again, it doesn't mean that you're not loving, but I really think it's a terrible thing that people are really so worried what other people think. There are people around the world, folks, they're dying because of our lack of courage on this. We need to live out our faith. Courage is cool, right? You know, having a jazz patch and tattoos and never talking about Jesus, I don't consider that cool.
Another guest asks, can virtue be maintained without Christ?
Can virtue be maintained without Christ?
Right.
I would
He
say,
says, you seem to be saying American patriotism is equal or possibly replaceable to faith.
oh, no, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying, the trick is that as a Christian, I don't have to insist on Christian faith. In other words, I think that you can still have a culture where people are, I guess what I'm trying to say is that what Wilberforce and others did in Great Britain is they made the culture so that people understood that loving your neighbor is the right thing. Many of them didn't know why.
Right.
Now, I'm not happy that they don't know why, but I think that people who bring everything to theology, you can make an equal mistake by insisting that nothing matters except talking about Jesus. I think that you push people away from Jesus. There's nothing worse, in my opinion, than pushing people away from the source of truth. And that if you only can see things theologically and get in theological arguments, that's a problem. I don't think that, from my point of view, if I believe God is truth, God is love, and I believe Jesus is God. But I don't go around saying 1 + 1 is true, therefore that's Christian truth. And I want to tell you that that is a Christian apple and that's a Christian tree. You can have a more holistic view that if all truth is of God, I don't need to be talking about it all the time. I don't need to carve Jesus as Lord on an apple when I hand it to a hungry person. But there are people who would say, well, then what's the point? They'll be hungry and they'll go to hell forever. I'm not advocating that either. But what I am saying is that I think you can make a mistake if you, part of what I'm trying to say is that on the one hand, you want to live your faith out as boldly as possible. But I think you can become annoying where all you ever do is talk. On my radio show, for example, I talk about all kinds of things. The other day, I interviewed a woman who just translated the Odyssey into English. First woman ever to translate Homer's Odyssey into English. We had an amazing 2-hour conversation. I think we played part of it today. God doesn't come up. Jesus doesn't come up. It's a delightful conversation. I think that we have to have the ability to live our lives in such a way that we don't feel this horrible pressure to be specifically religious every moment. So I'm talking about things that are principles. I don't think that we should enshrine patriotism as an alternative religion. That becomes nationalism. That leads to the death of religion in the best sense. I mean, so I appreciate where that question's coming from. The answer ends up being pretty complicated. But I just want to say I think I get what that person's saying.
Then I'm going to give you one last really complicated one. How do we reconnect the flower of our civilization back to our spiritual roots?
Well, I think you just go back to the roots. In other words, the roots are, in my book, If You Can Keep It, I talk about all of these things that I didn't learn growing up. If you learn those things, you are connected to the roots, basically. If Americans start learning those things, everything just changes automatically. You're suddenly reconnected. It's not about connecting, the metaphor breaks down at some point, right? This flower is going to die. But the point is that we need to connect to the roots so that the new flowers are alive and they create more flowers. And I think that we've got to connect to the founders' vision of our Constitution, of our democracy. If we don't understand all that stuff, it just naturally goes away. The natural state of man is not self-government and freedom and respect. That's not the normal state of affairs.
Great. One last one.
One last one.
As this region enters into this new phase where we're trying to work closer together and to understand each other and do bigger things. Could you give us 3 things to think about as we go into this journey?
No.
2?
Thank you. That concludes our
Well,
lecture.
I think, I actually think that the creativity in this room is probably, in other words, I really think, yesterday I talked more about Wilberforce, but the thing is that, I believe that everyone is different. And so some people will be called specifically to certain things. In Wilberforce's day, there were so many things wrong with the culture, and he didn't say we've all got to work on this one thing. He understood that, properly speaking, people will be drawn to different things. Some people are drawn to street ministry. I want to work with the homeless. Some people say, well, I would never want to do that. I don't feel comfortable doing that. Everybody's different. And when you try to make a doctrine that it's got to be one thing, there are enough problems, there is enough ignorance that, I didn't mean to point to you. It was your joke. It was the joke. I was referring to your joke. That there's plenty of ignorance and there's plenty of problems for everybody, and we don't need to have a one-size-fits-all solution. I think that I would say that it's important that everybody understand that this is up to you. I mean, speaking as a Christian, I always say, it's up to the church. The church is you. You're the church. Don't complain about the church. You are the church if you claim to be a Christian. And if you're an American, it's up to you. The founders understood that everyone needs to participate. So how you participate, what you do, there is an infinity of options. I just think everybody needs to understand we need to get busy. I would say the most simple metric is, when I heard about the school ranking, that is the easiest thing to get a quick win, where you can just say, we've done something there, and you'll feel good about yourselves, and you'll do more and more and more and more. But I would say that's something that there's 100 ways to attack that one. Beware of thinking that technology can solve the problem. If only we could get everybody laptops, or if only we could be. It's really up to people, generally speaking. But I also would say that each person, I've already said this, but this is the most important thing, is that every person has to understand whatever you have, whatever it is. Some people I know here are fabulously wealthy when it comes to money. Some of you have tremendous talents. Some of you have time. I have no time in my life at this point. Everybody's got something different. Whatever you have, understand that it is a gift. You don't deserve it. If you think you deserve it, you're mistaken. It's a gift. You say, well, I worked hard. Well, let me tell you, God gave you the ability to work hard. God gave you the opportunity. In other words, don't denigrate yourself, but understand that you have gifts. Whatever you have is given to you in part to bless others. That is just a fact. And if you want to live your life fully so that you don't regret it when you're on your deathbed, you got to take that seriously. You have to take that seriously. When you're on your deathbed, you're not going to say, man, if I would just spend another 20 hours in the office. You know you're not going to say that. If I just had another 100 million, oh man. Folks, beware. Life is short. You could be dead tomorrow. We don't know what the future holds. I think that we need to take this seriously. Every human being needs to take this seriously. We're here for a short season, and it is a privilege that we get to be here and use what we have to do some good. The opportunities in this neck of the woods, as you know, are huge. And I think that, based on this evening and what Patrick Payton was saying, that just the idea that you all are willing to come here and to open your minds to what might I do, that is huge, folks. You are ahead of 99.9% of the communities in this country. So I just want to say, go for it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And our Christmas lights are pretty good, too.
What's that?
Our Christmas lights are pretty good, too.
Oh, really?
At this time, let's hear some closing comments from our leader, Patrick Payton.
Well, I'm going to answer the question real quickly because I know you've been sitting for a long time and you want to go out and see Eric and purchase some more of his books and shake his hand, and some of you might need to get home. I don't know. But thank you for being here to start the conversation. The question was asked, what are 3 things that we can do? Let me read 7. Number 1, raise your expectations. Stop acting like we shouldn't be anything other than excellent in the entire Permian Basin. Number 2, refuse to blame anyone else anymore. Refuse to blame the people before you. Refuse to blame neighbors. Refuse to blame anyone anymore. Reject the apathy of they have already tried this. This is just an excuse to not do something, and it's a cloaked veil of the fear of failure. I'm convinced that most of us do not press into the unknown because we're afraid we might succeed, but don't be afraid. Number 4, get actively engaged. Attend meetings, run for office, have a conversation. Everybody keeps asking me, what's next? What's next? Have a conversation. Nothing moves faster than the speed of trust. Find your place of passion and concern and work it. Become a nuisance if you have to. Number 5, seek to understand and then work for common good for all. It's not about Midland. It's not about Odessa. It's about the Permian Basin, the most important region in the world. Number 6, reject complaining without an even greater commitment to engage what you are complaining about. It's easy to be negative. It's another thing to find a solution. And number 7, start where you are. Excellence, greatness, heightened expectations at home and at work. Let's make this the envy of the country, the envy of the world, because we have changed the geopolitical landscape underground. Let's change it above ground. Thank you for being here. God bless you. Would you express your appreciation and thanks to Eric Metaxas? Thank you so much. Bob, thank you. You are dismissed. We'll see you soon.